Hello everyone, and welcome back to another gear considerations video. Today I wanted to talk about cold weather and snow gear considerations. So what I mean when I'm saying cold weather, for a few caveats up front, this is only going to be based on my own experience in my own area, of course. And so what that means as far as cold weather is at coldest about -15 Fahrenheit. Right now it is 10 Fahrenheit, so just keep that in mind if you're in an area that's colder than where I am. You may want to consider a few additional layers and all that when I start talking about layering. And if you're somewhere warmer, of course, maybe you don't need as much as I'm going to be talking about. And furthermore, please do not mistake this for Arctic considerations, because that involves very different gear, and it's also not something I have experience with. I just have experience here. So we're going to go ahead and get started. The first thing I want to talk about is the most important thing to not freezing to death, and that's going to be layering itself. So you're going to want to have a lot of layers when you're in the cold weather, of course. Starting for me, what I usually do, and you're going to hear a lot of people generally have somewhat similar layers, but there's slight disagreement probably. For me, what I do is, starting with the base layer, what you're going to want to make sure on actually all of these layers is that you avoid cotton like it's the plague. Wool and synthetics, specifically merino wool, are the cure to this plague. There's only one area where cotton doesn't matter as much, and that's with the camouflaging, but there is some issues with that as well, which I'll get into later. But for the base layer, what I usually like to use is a synthetic base layer. Usually I go with a lightweight one, because then I build up a bunch of the extra layers over it, and you don't want to get too hot either. And it's a mistake I made as well some years back, but it's very easy to overdress as well, even when it is this cold. And if you start sweating, that's even worse, because then you get even colder, as you might imagine, and then you die. That's never good. So a lightweight, and different companies tend to disagree a little bit on the weights, but usually lightweight is fairly consistent. If it gets exceptionally cold, sometimes I will go to a mid-weight base layer, but by and large, for most of the temperatures I'm concerned with when I'm talking about cold weather, a lightweight synthetic base layer does great. Moving up from there is going to be my just standard shirt. Usually that's going to be a heavier flannel shirt, but even just a standard, just completely normal collared shirt is what I'll go with. Next is a liner or an insulating vest. What I'm wearing currently is an insulating vest. For this layer, I usually prefer something that either buttons up or ideally zips up, just not something that's a pullover, because if it does start to warm up or you're doing a lot of activity, you will want to potentially be able to unzip this layer a little bit to let some air flow. And then finally after that is where I put the big puffy insulating layer. In my case, I'm wearing an ANA jacket, very warm. Does have a bit of an issue with camouflaging, however, which is my next point. So the last layer is going to be the camouflage layer, and that can be either over whites or some sort of smock. One thing before I do get too into the camouflaging is I should mention, depending on the snow in your area, you might have some disagreement on whether you should put a rain layer on before this or just skip it altogether. In my case, I'm not wearing one because in my area the snow is very generally powdery and not that wet. If it does happen to be pretty wet, I tend to just wear rain pants, but my top tends to be fine, so I don't go with any extra rain gear. It gets exceptionally hot, exceptionally quick if you stack too much rain gear along with all the rest of this cold weather gear, because a lot of rain gear does not breathe very well at all. Now the reason I wanted to mention the rain gear here in this layer is because there are some over whites, for example, Cries. They have some water repellency to them, which is great. In my case, my over whites are just a surplus layer that is partially made of cotton, so not ideal there. The reason that water repellency works well is it does help if you're going through kind of if there's a lot of dust in your area and it's still snowy. It prevents these from getting really dirty and then kind of standing out and being too brown compared to your backdrop. Or if it is really wet snow in your area, then of course it works ideal for that as well, to keep the rest of your layers underneath just totally dry. But the reason that I'm wearing a smock and white pants rather than just going full over whites is if you look in the background, of course I do have a fence here, but if you look at the trees, for example, if you're in a heavily wooded environment, you're going to have a lot of brown, and just full white doesn't work very well. Now if you're in somewhere, for example, where there's a lot of sagebrush or a lot of just scrub, maybe going full over whites, if there is enough snow to warrant it, does help. I tested some of this Schneetarn, these overwhites, in some particularly heavy snow when it was in one of those areas where I feel like it would work well. And you can see on the footage here, it did pretty well. However, you might be able to pick me out a little bit because I was wearing my gear over the camouflaging layer, and it kind of stands out because I do have some black stuff that I need to replace on here and eventually go to all green. But kind of keep an eye out for that. You may want to consider, if you don't need to get to your stuff super quick and you are more worried about camouflaging, to maybe put your chest rig and all that underneath your camouflaging layer. But then of course you can't get to it as quickly, so there's a little bit of a trade-off there that will be determined based on just how quickly you need to get to stuff. And then one more thing to add as a kind of additional layer is, if you see I'm wearing a shamag here, any neck covering will do really well, something that you can just tie around somewhat loosely. It helps to really trap in the air. Even if you have all these layers, what tends to get really cold is your neck, because there's a lot of air just kind of coming out of here. So having a neck covering helps to tie in almost a lot of the warmth. And for me, usually I will tie this on right underneath my insulating layer and then put the insulating layer over it, so it kind of, as I said, helps to bundle it in particularly well there. And then in addition to a neck covering, it helps a ton to have a balaclava. Usually I'll wear a green balaclava. Having something that's either an earth tone or a green, as well as having a full white one, it could be a good idea. So I always have a balaclava just in my butt pack here. One thing you'll want to look for when you are picking up a balaclava is make sure to get one that's on the longer side. The reason you'll want that is you don't want it to ride up. Usually I like to tie this balaclava and kind of push it into whatever neck covering I'm wearing. And actually, usually I put it on before putting on the shamag. Just for the video I didn't bother. But usually when I'm actually wearing this, I will put this on underneath the shamag. That way it ties in with the neck covering and there's no air escaping. It's just nice and warm. With a lot of the shorter balaclavas you have, they will, when you're just looking around and with movement, it'll eventually ride up and you'll have a little gap here that'll get really, really cold. And then one more thing, if it's not too terribly cold, like even right now I could probably get away with it. Ideally, I do prefer to wear the balaclava pushed under my nose. The reason for that is so that my glasses don't fog up. There are balaclavas out there that have breathing holes cut into them. And personally, I've found that every single one of those still have an issue with fogging up. So to prevent that fogging, I do sacrifice a little bit of warmth on my nose to just pull it down and prevents that. And then with all these layers, just make sure that you can get in and out of them easily. You may not think this with cold weather, but it is very easy as you are doing a lot of activity to start to sweat. And as I said earlier, of course, you do not want to sweat because that will just get you even colder. And in the long run, that's really, really bad. So something that you can unzip while you're walking easily or take off entirely if need be is definitely something you'll want to look for, especially in these outer and in the insulating and the liner layer. That is always something that I particularly seek out. If you're more interested in layering, I kind of went through this fairly quickly because there was other points I want to get to, but currently Spiritus Systems is doing an ongoing series that is really, really good, talking about a lot of the nitty-gritty on each of these layers, so I would recommend checking that out if you were interested in delving a bit further, such as on the materials. But for this video, I'm going to be moving on now to my next point, which is some more gear you might want to think about taking that I usually carry in the backpack, this third line gear. So there's a few things that I would recommend to think about taking in a backpack when you're packing up for cold weather. The first of which is a emergency blanket or a bivvy, as I have here, just nice and wrapped up, nice and small, so it doesn't take up too much space. That is good in case you do happen to get stranded out there and you don't want to freeze to death, especially when it gets dark. It gets significantly colder then. And speaking of the cold, if you do need to start a fire, of course, have good fire discipline. You should have multiple methods of starting a fire just in case your main one goes down. But one that I have found that always works quite well, that a lot of people overlook, is actually road flares. Not a joke. Some people know about this and then other people don't even believe it and laugh it off, but these actually do work really well. Of course, they burn hot as hell, and they burn for generally as long as you'll need. Take multiple ideally, but even just one should usually burn as long as you need to get a fire started. I'm not going to go too into the specifics on how to start a fire, but one other thing to think about with starting a fire is to make sure to gather dry wood, which is a little hard if it's this snowy, but for example on the underside of logs and all of that. Another video recommendation I would recommend to take a look at is Paul Harrell, somewhat recently, a few months ago now, did a video on how to start a fire in, I believe he called it adverse weather or in inclement conditions, which would definitely apply here. So definitely take a look at that as far as what kind of materials you'd want to gather or take with you for starting a fire. But road flares, they do work great. Just be mindful of the fumes. If you do need to use a road flare, don't be breathing that in and causing yourself long-term health issues. Another thing I always take, and this actually goes beyond just the winter, but particularly in the winter, goggles, as I have here. And the reason I like these, so when it gets windy and extremely cold, it's pretty hard to keep your eyes open, and maybe I just have sensitive eyes, but I usually like to wear these cut down on the wind that actually touches your eyes entirely. And also if there's dust flying around, that way you don't get any of that in your eyes. Would definitely recommend it for that. Another recommendation I would have as far as stuff to carry in your backpack, I think it's very important to have a cleaning rod. I usually like to carry a disassemblable type. That way it just packs down easier. But make sure you're getting an actual steel one, just as I have here. Now the reason I recommend having a steel cleaning rod is so that if you get any bore obstructions, for example in the cold weather, if you fall down in the snow and you get a lot of snow and potentially ice packed in your barrel, you definitely, if you have the time, you don't want to risk taking a shot with that. So I like to carry a steel cleaning rod to push through any ice, or also, any other bore obstructions. It doesn't have to be cold weather. It could be a bullet lodged in there from a squib load or mud, etc. And you don't need to take a full cleaning kit with you. It can be a good idea to take some extra gun oil, maybe some CLP in there. But one thing I would recommend to also take is just have a cleaning patch on there. I just have one here already on there, and that way it'll just kind of absorb, if you are trying to push it through any ice, just kind of absorb some of that water. Just a little bit extra helps. So I already talked a bit about camouflaging as far as layering it over your clothes. One other thing, by the way, I would recommend, if you can, get a winter jacket that's actually a better color. Mine's blue. It's kind of a cool looking camo, but you can see a little bit peeking out here, even with this camo layer I have over it, so it's not ideal. It's something I'm going to be fixing soon anyway. But in addition to camouflaging yourself, also consider camouflaging your gear as well as your rifle. So some good ways to do that. A very simple way to do it is to just get like a white bed sheet, just cut it up, and then you can just wrap it around your rifle. What I have here is a sock. Just, you can make it yourself, and I call it a sock, more of a sleeve, but you can just sew up a sock out of some snow camo, as I did here, and then put this over your handguard. And if you do go this route, just make sure to make it a little bit baggy. That way you can cut down on any straight lines, and this does camouflage up quite nicely. To take it a step further, you can also wrap camouflage, either camouflage tape or, as I said earlier, bed sheets, something like that, around your rifle and your gear as well. For example, if you have a chest rig on. Only thing to keep in mind with that is just make sure you're not blocking anything critical. On the rifle, don't block the ejection port. And on your gear, don't potentially block something that you need to access. Just kind of check everything on all your pouches, that make sure you can still access it if you do happen to tie around a few knots of cloth or camo wrap. So that covers it for the majority of this video. Before I actually ended it, however, I did want to talk about just a few miscellaneous things that I couldn't really think of where else they would fit. The first of which is just be mindful and research the signs of hypothermia, be familiar with them. Two of the biggest, and by no means are they the only signs, but two of the most easy to identify ones are slurred speech, and that's not like cold, like your mouth is cold, like mine's freezing right now, but not like that type of slurred speech. You'll notice it when someone's actually having slurred speech from hypothermia versus their mouth and lips just being really cold. The second of which is excessive shivering, or even worse, if the shivering stops, that is a very big sign of hypothermia, and you should definitely seek shelter or start a fire, something like that, when that happens. And then one more thing to just mention on boots. I would still recommend, if you want to go back and check out my gear considerations on boots video, I would probably recommend about the same, maybe a slightly more insulated pair of boots for cold weather. In my case, I just tend to wear heavier socks. Right now I'm wearing a pretty thick pair of merino wool socks, and they are comfortable. I'm not cold at all. If you are going through really cold weather, as in probably colder than I've ever really had to deal with, and you're in a lot of snow, you could take a look at these extreme boots here. These are cowboy packing boots, and these are super heavily insulated and quite tall, as you can see, so they're great to get through really thick snow. But I did just want to say that is a very extreme example. In most cases, you won't need that. As I said, usually I wear the same type of boots all year round, and they work pretty well. And two more things really quickly I nearly forgot to mention. Did want to kind of talk a little bit about what type of gloves to wear. So for cold weather, these are pretty thick. They're actually quite warm though. They work quite well. If it gets extremely cold, you might want to think about actually wearing mittens. And you can actually still do quite a bit of stuff with mittens. Of course, it's always nice to still have separate fingers for dexterity, but mittens are great for warmth because then all your fingers are sharing the warmth because they're all in the same kind of compartment there. Whenever possible though, I would recommend at the least, if you can afford it with the temperatures where you're at, to wear a regular glove like this on your shooting hand, and then if you have to wear mittens for cold, to wear that on your non-dominant hand. And then for the type of camouflage, I would recommend for cold weather, generally the arid or multicam adjacent. In the case of this, all those types of camouflages tend to work well. The one thing you'll want to keep in mind about arid camouflage, while it will work well in most environments, in the winter, because everything's dead and all that, it does tend to be lighter because it is made for an arid environment where it's way hotter. So tends to not work that well just because of temperatures. But if you're just using it as a camouflaging layer over an insulating layer, it'll work great. Of course, if you are, especially with the arid camouflages, make sure to buy them either a size or even 2 sizes up. But other than that, multicam, arid, or phantom leaf I've found works great. And I think from what I've seen, I would also recommend con camo brown, but I've been having a really hard time finding any that's in stock for this sort of a smock setup. And also really quickly, to talk a bit about hat selection, it is of course pretty much essential to have some form of warm hat for the cold weather. My favorite in pretty much every season, but especially in the winter, is the old Feldmütze from the World War II era ones. The newer Bundeswehr ones I quite like for the summer, but these are nice because you can actually, if you don't have any other head covering, you can unbutton the front here and pull it down, and it keeps your ears warm. Generally, I don't worry too much about ear warmth though, because and another reason why I like this hat is because I'm using it a bunch with hearing protection. So if you're wearing over-ear hearing protection such as Peltors, you still maintain a really good seal here, as you can see, which is why I prefer them over beanies, which I know a lot of people like, and beanies do have their own advantages too, of course, because of course these just immediately cover your ears. But the issue I've had, and the reason I don't really wear beanies anymore, is because they don't give as good of a seal, especially when you get to these bigger winter beanies on your ears for your hearing protection. And additionally, you do have an actual brim, which I always do like to keep the sun off your face a little bit more, or rain, or if it's wet snow, same sort of thing, keep all that off of your face. But it's a bit of a trade-off because with the beanie, you can just fold this up and just throw it in a pocket really easily. So that brings us to the end of the video. Thank you all a bunch, especially if you got this far through the entire video. Let me know if you have any other questions in the comments below, or also if you have anything else you would like to add, other gear recommendations for stuff people should be packing, or if you think that I should be packing. I would love to hear it. Always open to more suggestions in that regard. And let me know if you have any other suggestions for video ideas or something like that you want me to do in the future. Otherwise, that is all I've got for this video. So thank you again for watching, and I hope to see you all in the next one. Take care.